This is called Social Beliefs and Judgments. It could just be called Beliefs and Judgments because that's what it is. It's talking about our beliefs and the judgments that we make, and they just tack social into the beginning because it's social psychology and they love the word social. So here we see a group of people judging yes for something that has to do with Scotland, I believe. So how do we judge our social worlds, consciously and unconsciously? They talk about how we have two systems. System 1 is unconscious and system 2 is conscious. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today is in our system 1, which is our subconscious. So priming is one of these examples. So priming is activating particular associations in memory. For example, watching a scary movie at home, and then that primes us to interpret furnace noises as a possible intruder. This works with perceiving and interpreting information as well. If we if we own a red car, then we'll start to notice all of the other red cars on the road as well, and stuff like that. And there's also a concept called embodied cognition. It is not necessarily what you think, so take the word body out of that and combine it with cognition, so it's like body cognition. It's how the way we think is influenced by the way we physically experience the world. For example, when we say someone is a warm person, we're not saying that they're physically feeling warm, we're saying they're a kind person, and we associate warmth with kindness or with friendliness. And they've actually done experiments where if you change someone's physical temperature, they will interpret things differently. And so the way we physically experience things does prime us to think and make different judgments than we normally would. All right, another part of system 1 is what when people talk about having gut feelings or following their intuition. So you make intuitive judgments. The powers of intuition are automatic, and I think they're trying to say controlled there. But I don't know what they mean by that, because maybe they're saying it's controlled by our subconscious, because it isn't really controlled. Intuition has its limits because it is based on a person's beliefs, and so intuition only takes you as far as your beliefs take you. So if you have false beliefs, you're gonna have bad intuition. All right, overconfidence. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about how we see ourselves. We're sometimes overconfident in estimating things, and we're unaware of our errors. So there's confirmation bias, which is when we are eager to verify our beliefs and less inclined to disprove them. And they actually gave an example in the textbook of people being paid to visit a seminar of opposing views or to go for free to a seminar that it confirmed their views. And the majority of people chose to go to the free one rather than receiving money to go to the one that would argue against them. And so there are some remedies for overconfidence. Hear someone say something incorrectly, give them prompt feedback, telling them why they are wrong. Just kidding. When you are planning, for the planning fallacy, which is what we talked about before. For the planning fallacy that we talked about last time, where you underestimate how long it'll take you to do something, they say you should unpack the task, break it down into estimated time requirements, which is actually something that they do in my college classes. They say in the introduction, all right, here are this week's tasks, and this should be how long it takes you to do them. And they overestimate in that so that you can plan more than enough time to get the things done. So you can also try to get people to think of one good reason why their judgment might be wrong. And this is a great way to counter overconfidence, especially in matters of opinion. Say, okay, that's your opinion and you feel like it's fact, but what is one reason why that might not be true? And that is a great way to get them thinking of the other person's perspective or the other side's perspective. All right, we've got some heuristics that we use. Heuristics are mental shortcuts. And one of those examples is in cognitive psychology. For example, you have this heuristic where if I draw this, la 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 la. Instead of seeing a bunch of V's, you probably see a star, even though it's a very badly formed star. But that's what you see. And that is because your mind just connects the dots. And so sometimes this happens in our social environment as well. So we got the representative heuristic, and that is the tendency to presume, sometimes despite contrary odds, that someone or something belongs to a particular group if they resemble a typical member. And there's also the availability heuristic. That's a cognitive rule. They judge the likelihood of things in terms of their availability in memory. If instances of something come readily to mind, we presume it to be commonplace. Sorry, I wonder who wrote these because there are a lot of typos on this slide. Let me see if they're gonna give examples in these. Nope. All right, I will. So representativeness heuristic. So one of the examples they give is, let me describe someone to you. If I was to describe someone and say, this is a woman and she is very passionate about equal gender roles in the workplace and equal gender pay. And she took women's rights classes in college, and now she works as an accountant. And so then I would ask you, what is the probability that she is a good accountant? And what is the probability that she is a good accountant and a feminist? And a lot of people say, oh, it's more likely that she's a good accountant and a feminist because of all those things. And that's because I gave you a lot of characteristics that you associate with feminism. But really, logically speaking, it's more likely that a person is going to be one thing rather than a combination of two things. So it's more likely that she's a good accountant, even though I didn't give you any information on her accounting abilities. All right, and then there's the availability heuristic. So an example of this is they did a survey of Americans asking, okay, how many people do you think are homosexual? And the average number that was given was 25%. 25% of Americans are homosexual, or American adults. And actually, it's only about 5%. But because we hear about them so much in the news and we see them all the time in the media, we assume that it's more common than it actually is because it's readily available in our mind. All right, so there's also counterfactual thinking, which is where we mentally simulate what might have been. And I was just doing this the other day, although I can't now remember what happened. But this is a very common thing, and it is like the feeling of regret is stronger the closer you are to your what might have been situation. For example, when you drive in your car, normally you get there safely, and then you don't really think about, oh my goodness, I might have been in a car accident. But if you're driving in your car, and then you swerve and almost hit somebody, and you're almost in that accident, then you think more, oh my goodness, what would have happened if I'd been in that accident? What if I had died? And then you start to simulate what might have been. And this happens with athletes as well. Like the closer the gap between silver and gold, like if it's only 0.03 seconds, then the more discontent the silver medalist is, because they were very close to getting that gold. And so that is counterfactual thinking, where you're literally thinking against the facts, thinking what might have been. There's also illusionary thinking, which is basically where people develop superstitions. So an illusory correlation, basically the illusion of a correlation, is where you think you see a relationship where none exists, or you perceive a stronger relationship than actually exists. And so this is common in gambling. You get gamblers' superstitions where they want to choose their own numbers, or they want to do their habits or their routines in order to get the highest amount of luck, even though you can't control your luck. That's the definition of luck. And then there's also a tendency that's called the regression toward average. So, for example, if you are having a really bad day, chances are your day will get better. It's not very likely that it'll get a lot worse. Of course, sometimes it will, but generally it regresses towards average. And same if you're having an amazing day, then something is going to happen that's going to pop your bubble and your day's going to get back to average. Or in exams, or in a class, when two students take an exam and one of them scores really well, then maybe they get overconfident and then they score more towards the average in the next one. Or on the other side, the other student does really poorly, and so then they prepare more for the next one and get more towards the average. And so that is a tendency, but sometimes we'll have something like, say we're having a really bad day, and then we decide to change out of our pink shirt into a purple shirt, and then suddenly our day gets better. Like I said, this is normal for your day to get better, but you might interpret changing your shirt to having a better day. And so then you think, oh, whenever I'm having a bad day, I just need to change my shirt and then it'll all be better. And I mean, it might create a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's, not changing your shirt doesn't change what happens during your day that directly. And so, that's that. All right, moods and judgments. So when we have good and bad moods, they trigger memories of experiences associated with those moods. And so if you have someone in a good mood and you have them have a conversation with someone, then they will more positively remember that conversation than if they had that same conversation but they were in a bad mood. That's the moods color our interpretations of current experiences. The one I was supposed to be talking about, they trigger memories of experiences associated with those moods. So a very strong example of this is when marriage is failing, people within that marriage, that couple, they tend to remember mostly the bad experiences. So they might remember that the caterers weren't on time for their wedding instead of remembering the happy dance that they had together. And so your mood will...
Talking. I'm not Tova.
How do we perceive our social world? Perceiving and interpreting events. So I don't remember the specific experiment they're referring, but I know that the big point they made was that people tend to view their political party as winning when there's doubt. For example, in the presidential debate, everyone comes away thinking their candidate won and believing more strongly in their candidate. And then, when their candidate loses, they normally blame it on other events other than the quality of their candidate. So, and this goes along with belief perseverance, persistence of one's initial conceptions, such as when the bias for one's belief is discredited. Oh, that doesn't make sense. Okay, even when the basis for one's belief is discredited, but an explanation of why the belief might be true survives. So there's a very interesting experiment they gave where they told someone a fact, people who drive across the Brooklyn Bridge can have a higher rates of contracting brain cancer. So there's something that's completely false. But they told them the fact and they told them it was true. And then they asked, so why do you think this is? And then they had the participant come up with an explanation for it. And then they told them, well, that it isn't actually true. But when they measured their belief later on in that study, the participants still believed in that false fact. And they believed that it was because they had come up with an explanation that made sense to them. And so, that belief persevered. All right, constructing memories of ourselves and our worlds. So this is where it talks about how memory is not like taking photographs and keeping them in a scrapbook. It is very subjective. When we create the memory as well as when we retrieve the memory, both times the memory is going to be subjective from our past experience and from our current experience. So they talk about rosy retrospection. This is where we remember things as being better than they were, especially like vacations. Think about vacations, think, oh my goodness, it was so much fun. And we don't remember the bad parts of it because we're comparing it to our current everyday situation, and we see with the rose-colored glasses. That's why it's rosy retrospection. We also sometimes underestimate earlier liking. Oh, like this, again, the example of the marriage where someone would remember previous nice experiences more poorly because of their current bad mood. We also reconstruct our past behaviors. So sometimes they found people going through therapy for to help them quit smoking or to quit drinking. And then they'd do before and after surveys, and they'd find that while their behavior didn't improve as much, the participants or the clients felt like it had helped a lot. And they described their past behavior as being worse than it actually had been. And then that gave them a feeling of having improved. And so that is another way we perceive ourselves incorrectly. All right, so this is how do we explain our social world? So this is where we talk a lot about attributing causality. Do we attribute it to the person or do we attribute it to the situation? And what happens commonly is misattribution, where we attribute a behavior to the wrong source. And we'll go on and explain this a little more. So the attribution theory is another word for what we're talking about right now. It's the theory of how we explain others' behavior. So there's the dispositional attribution, where you attribute it to the person, and the situational attribution, where you attribute it to the situation. So this is an example. We often infer that people's actions are indicative of their intentions and dispositions. So the way people act, we believe that it is who they are. And this is why people say first impressions are important, because the way you act when you first meet someone, they will infer from their interaction with you what kind of person you are, even if that first meeting wasn't an accurate representation of who you were. A great example that the author gave in the textbook was he was doing job interviews, and he interviewed one person in a setting where it was him along with 5 other professionals, and they each asked the participant 2 or 3 questions in a very official setting. And that participant, to him, seemed very withdrawn and nervous and flustered. And I mean, when you think about it, you would be too in that job situation. But for the same position, he had an interview that took place at a coffee house one-on-one. And that person was much more warm and friendly. And so he made that instant inference oh, this first person is very withdrawn and maybe a little socially awkward, whereas the second person is much more friendly, so they would be more enjoyable to work with. When actually, that would be a dispositional attribution, where he was attributing their behaviors to who they were, but it was actually, he realized, probably situational, where the first person was in a very intense, uncomfortable situation, so they were intense and uncomfortable, whereas the second person was in a more relaxed and comfortable situation, so they were more relaxed and comfortable. And so that is an example of misattribution, and where he was inferring traits that weren't actually necessarily true. And this is spontaneous trait inference. And I'm not looking forward to the exam because they've got, this attributing causality and attribution theory and dispositional attribution, situational attribution. And then we've got inferring traits and spontaneous trait inference. And if I do a spontaneous trait inference instead of inferring traits, that's going to be the wrong answer. Anyway, I'm digressing, but phew, okay. So spontaneous is what it sounds like, where you automatically infer a trait after exposure to someone's behavior. You don't necessarily do this consciously, but you just think, oh wow, that person just exploded and yelled at her child here in the grocery store. I guess she's just, she's a terrible mother. So that might be a spontaneous trait inference. All right, how do we explain it? We also get the fundamental attribution error, which is another term that I'm going to have to differentiate between all these. Okay, so it is the tendency for observers to underestimate situational influences and overestimate dispositional influences upon others' behavior. So this is what we've been talking about, where you see someone acting and then you assume it's because of who they are and not because of the situation they're in. And then an example it gives is assuming questioning hosts on game shows are more intelligent than contestants, when the game show hosts have the advantage because they can ask the questions based on their wealth of knowledge. Right, why do we make this attribution error? I believe it's because of perspective and situational awareness. So we have the actor-observer perspectives, where we are basically the actors. And as an actor, you know yourself, and you know when you're reacting to the situation and when you're just reacting because of who you are. For example, when I get mad at Zoe, I'm normally reacting to her snapping at me or her peeing on the carpet. It's not because I'm an angry person. And I recognize that because I can see the situation. But when someone is observing me, they're focused on me. They're not focused on taking in the situation. I am the situation that they're taking in. And so then they assume that I'm an angry person because that is what their perspective is telling them. They had a camera perspective bias, which is where if people watched confessions where the camera was focused on the suspect giving the confession, they were more likely to believe the confession was genuine. Whereas if the confession was recorded while the camera was pointed at the investigator, they were more likely to think the confession was coerced. And so because of this, in many states, there is now a law where if you're going to present a confession at court, it has to show both people equally, both the suspect and the questioner equally. So our perspectives on people will change with time. If people saw me being mad at Zoe once and then spent a day with us and realized, oh, I'm generally not an angry person, then they can adapt their belief of me. And there are also cultural differences where people in, like last week we talked about collectivistic societies, or not last week, last video. People in those societies are more like or less likely to make this fundamental attribution error. All right, so why do we make this? Oh yeah, this is again cultural differences. Where it shows this, okay, there's a negative attitude, negative behavior, he's rude to his colleague. There's a dispositional, he's a hostile person, or the situational, he was unfairly evaluated. And so these can lead to either unfavorable reactions, like I don't like him, or sympathetic reactions. Right, self-fulfilling prophecies. So belief that leads to its own fulfillment. This is shown in experimenter bias, where experimenters expect people to behave in a certain way, and so then they unconsciously elicit that response. And so that's why double-blind studies are great when they're possible, because then you can help eliminate the experimenter bias. And it also gives this example where the teacher expects, oh, Rena's older brother was brilliant, so she is too. And so she smiles more at Rena, calls on her more, teaches her more, gives her more time to answer. And Rena responds enthusiastically and learns better. And so that confirms her expectation that Rena is brilliant. They have seen this, although with varying results. Sometimes the results are extreme, sometimes they're moderated, but they have seen this in real classroom experiments, where if they tell teachers randomly assigned students are more gifted than others, then the teachers treat those students better. All right, how do our social worlds matter? So we get what we expect. There's behavioral confirmation. So it's the self-fulfilling prophecy where people's social expectations lead them to behave in ways that cause others to confirm their expectations. So a great example of this is social anxiety. If I am anxious that I'm going to be nervous, I'm going to act obviously more nervously, and that's not necessarily good social behavior. And people are going to treat me a little differently because I'm acting nervous. And because I have this heightened anxiety, I'm going to notice the difference in how they treat me. And so then I'm going to confirm my belief that I'm not a socially skilled person. And so that is an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy in social behavior. And that is it. Thank you.